Ani bonjour, Gakina Aruya. Good evening. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ali Genia. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a children's librarian here at the newly renovated Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. Thank you for coming tonight. Tonight, we have a wonderful talk by Tolanda Henderson, all about unexpected disability narratives in popular culture from Bridgerton to Doctor Strange. I will allow Tolanda to introduce themselves, and we'll get this thing kicked off.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tolanda Henderson, as has been mentioned. I'm a PhD candidate in the English department at the University of Connecticut, which is where I'm currently broadcasting from. I am studying Blackness and disability in young adult literature, but I have passed with popular culture and disability narratives, and that's where this presentation comes from. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to say is that there is a trigger warning. There will be discussions of the rape scene in Bridgerton later in the presentation. So there's a moment where I will mention it, and that won't have a trigger warning, but before an extended discussion of that scene, this slide will appear again. I'm hoping that there's a mix of people in the audience, that some folks are um, comfortable listening to that whole conversation, whereas other people will be taking themselves out, like putting something in front of the screen and just looking at the chat. And then if someone who is participating can put in the YouTube chat when that conversation is over, I'll indicate. That would be helpful. We can't do it from the back end. So I'm hoping that we can be community together, and take care of each other in that way. So I've structured the beginning of this around a series of questions. And so if we're going to ask the question, what is an unexpected disability narrative? The first question is, what is a disability narrative? And I should mention that the slides that I'm showing are mostly text, and when there are images, I will describe them. So what is a disability narrative? That begs the question, what is disability? There are several definitions of disability, kind of circling in the atmosphere. And one that is particularly impactful in people's lives is how the Social Security Administration defines disability, because they offer benefits or financial compensation for people who are disabled, but you have to demonstrate it in a particular way. So, according to the Social Security Administration, or the SSA, the law defines disability as an inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity, or SGA, by reason of any medically determinable physical or mental impairment or impairments, which can be expected to result in death, or which has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. So that's a bunch of words, and what it what it's getting at, that I want to highlight, is that this is a legal definition, and that it has to do with whether or not you can earn an income. Disability is defined here as either you can earn an income or you can't, and that's the determining factor. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which is, more recent than the SSA's definition, I believe, has a different take on what it means to be disabled. So the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded as having a disability. The ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that person's association with a person with a disability. So the ADA makes it unlawful to discriminate against disabled people and people who are thought to be disabled and people who are associated with people who are disabled. So This is different from the SSA, because the SSA is concerned with, can you earn a wage or can't you? Whereas here in the ADA, that impairment substantially limits one or more major life activities, which may or may not be holding down a job. The third and last definition, well, I guess I'll just say the third definition that I want to offer, comes from the World Health Organization, or the WHO. They state that, quote, disability results from the interaction between individuals with a health condition such as cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and depression, with personal and environmental factors, including negative attitudes, inaccessible transportation and public buildings, and limited social support. So again, this is different from both the SSA and the ADA definitions, in that this is not a law. This is not a legal document. It is a discussion of what disability means in the world. And what I like about this definition is that it doesn't locate disability in the individual who is impacted. It locates disability in the interaction between individuals and personal and environmental factors. So that's something to keep in mind that's different from the legal definitions, and something that is helpful. So, how does disability studies define disability? Well, that begs another question. You're going to get, well, I hope you don't get sick of my questions, but we first want to define disability studies before we can get into how disability studies defines disability. So Claire Mullaney has an article on JSTOR Daily and says that at its broadest, disability studies encourages scholars to value disability as a form of cultural difference. Again, this is different from the SSA. It's different from the ADA, because neither of them talked about cultural difference, which leads to this sense of value, that there's something there to be celebrated as opposed to something to be navigated and overcome. Mullaney also says that ability should not be the default when it comes to human worth, in terms of what disability studies has to say about disability. In 1998, Simi Linton published an article called Disability Studies, Not Disability Studies. And she defines not disability studies to help you understand, or help us to understand, the difference between working with disability and doing disability studies. So for not disability studies, those are the, quote, traditional interventionist models, the medicalized applied fields, and special education. These people work with people who have disabilities, but they're not doing disability studies. Disability studies, according to Linton, is a robust liberal arts-based inquiry into disability. So there are two ways of thinking about disability that are important here. There's a lot of models of disability, not just these two, but for today's presentation, I will limit it to two. The medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So the medical model of disability is the not disability studies angle. And it has the goal to change the individual. So if you have an individual who uses a wheelchair and they're trying to get into a building, but there's a flight of stairs, right? The medical model of disability says rehabilitate the individual, change their body, give them crutches, give them an exoskeleton, give them the means to actually walk up the stairs. The social model of disability has a goal of changing the environment. That idea is more to say, build a ramp, because then the person using the individual using the wheelchair would be able to access the building. Even further than that, universal design is an architectural premise that says that you should build the building without a flight of stairs to the front door in the first place, so that everybody can access it. And it benefits, universal design benefits more than the wheelchair user. It benefits the person with the stroller, the person with the wheelie luggage. So again, the medical model, you change the individual; the social model, you change the environment. So back to this question: how does disability studies define disability? Sammy Schalk wrote an entry on disability in a book called Keywords for Gender and Sexuality Studies. And she says, quote, "In disability studies, disability is a social and political category describing body minds that depart from the bodily, mental, and or behavioral norms of a society." So here we get into normal versus departing from normal, right? Expectations of normalcy and what happens when those are not met. Before I move on to the next slide, I do want to indicate that Schalk explains that the term body mind highlights how mental and physical processes not only affect each other, but also give rise to each other, collectively impacting our experiences of ourselves and the world. So she's taking the term body mind from Margaret Price. There's that kind of quote within a quote there. And it's intended to work against what is often called Cartesian duality. So, or Cartesian dualism. So Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." The mind is better than the body. They're two different things. Whereas if you're like me and you live with anxiety, you know that while anxiety is often starting up here in your head or experienced in your thoughts, it also can be like an actual palpitation in your chest as well. So, or elsewhere in your body. So the body mind connection is very important. So, getting back to the original question, what is a disability narrative? And I'm saying that a disability narrative is a story about body minds that depart from the bodily, mental, and or behavioral norms of a society. Some examples: disability visibility, first person stories from the 21st century. This was edited by Alice Wong. And on the screen on the left hand side is the cover of the book with those words, with the title and Alice Wong's name, and some kind of abstract art behind it that I don't feel confident describing. But it's a bunch of stories from people who live with disability, and it's everything from what it was like to be deaf in prison to what happens when you go to a art space or a theater space that's designed with disability in mind. I find the stories to be rather accessible, and I recommend this book. Another example of a disability narrative is the movie Crip Camp: A Disability Revolution, which was put out by Netflix in 2020. So the image on the screen has kind of a wavy line down the middle, and on the left-hand side is the name of the movie, as well as the description. It's an hour and 48 minutes long. It's a political documentary, and it's described as a groundbreaking summer camp galvanizes a group of teens with disabilities to help build a movement, forging a new path towards greater equality. And on the right side of the screen, you see an image from that camp. You can see camp type buildings in the background, and some trees are also there. The image includes a white person, or a white presenting person sitting in a wheelchair, smiling at the camera. And behind them stands a black presenting person with a guitar over his shoulder and one hand on the wheelchair. So you get this sense of this camp for teens with disabilities. It's a very powerful story, and I recommend it as well. So if a disability narrative is a story about body minds that defy expectations, then what is an unexpected disability narrative? It's a disability narrative that is easily missed. And so what I mean by that is, just because I see disability in a narrative doesn't mean everybody else sees that narrative and goes, oh, there's disability there. I was talking with one of the people on my PhD committee who is a disability studies scholar and who had seen Bridgerton. And I said, Bridgerton is a disability narrative. And she said, what? And it wasn't until I explained that she saw what I saw, even though she studies disability and was familiar with the narrative. So that's what I mean by an unexpected disability narrative. When we think of Bridgerton, we think of romance. Okay, not really. We think of Bridgerton and sex. Bridgerton and intrigue, gossip, fashion, aristocracy. But Bridgerton and disability is not something that most people think of. So to set the stage for those of you who may not be familiar, or just to be all on the same page, Bridgerton is the first season of Bridgerton is a Netflix adaptation of a book called The Duke and I by Julia Quinn. It's a Regency romance, which means it's set between 1811 and 1820. There is, in the genre, we expect to find an anachronistically independent heroine who must contend with strict social rules, a season packed with balls and dances, vicious gossip that spreads like wildfire, and a happily ever after, or HEA, with a reformed rake of a duke or viscount. And each of these elements is present in Bridgerton, both in the novel and in the series. You have Daphne Bridgerton, who goes to all of these balls. You have Lady Whistledown, who publishes a gossip rag. And the book does have the requisite happily ever after. The players in Bridgerton: Daphne Bridgerton and Simon Basset, Duke of Hastings. So Daphne Bridgerton is the eldest daughter of a viscount. She wants to get married, but she lacks suitors. Simon is the only son of a duke. He does not want to get married, but he is besieged by ambitious mamas, the mothers of young women who are on what they call the marriage mart. So they have this tension between them. The plot of the story is that Daphne, who wants suitors, and Simon, who does not want suitors, pretend to form an attachment. He seems to be occupied. She seems more desirable because she has his attention. And then they fall for each other, because of course they do. And then hijinks ensue. So why doesn't Simon want to get married? Because he doesn't want kids. And this is, 18 whatever. It's not like he has a lot of options for getting married, having relations with someone, but not having kids. It kind of goes hand in hand there. So don't get married if you don't want kids. Why doesn't Simon want kids? To spite his father. But why does Simon want to spite his father? Because Simon's father disowned him when Simon was a child. In the second episode, we see the Duke of Hastings, Simon's father, say, "Get him out of my sight. This boy is dead to me." So then the question becomes, why did Simon's father disown him? And the reason for that is because Simon stuttered. Now, some people would question whether stuttering is a disability. Mark Irwin, who is the board chair of the International Stuttering Association, describes the controversy with a series of points and counterpoints. He starts off with, stuttering is a legally defined disability in many countries of the world. Even so, to call stuttering a disability can provoke a strong negative reaction in both SLPs, or speech language pathologists, and people who stutter, PWS. One argument against using the word disability to describe stuttering is that it's not the right word. Quote, "This issue relates to the episodic nature of stuttering, its situational specificity, and differences in how its life impact is perceived by sufferers, as well as the fact that it can be ameliorated by therapy. So each of these things leads people to believe that disability is not the right word to describe stuttering. Irwin counterpoints and says disability is the right word to describe stuttering if stuttering is to be supported by the disability movement. So he's making a political point here. The second objection that Irwin discusses is that some people who stutter do not choose or want to see themselves as disabled. Canadian speech language pathologist, or SLP, Ann Meltzer, reported a survey in which she asked people who stutter, or PWS, to comment on this question: is stuttering a disability? The majority responded negatively to this statement. The counterpoint that Irwin offers is that it can also be argued that the same people who are not happy to see themselves as having a disability are also not happy about seeing themselves as people who stutter. In other words, there is a lot of shame, embarrassment, and denial for PWS, or people who stutter. So this also gets at the idea that is disability a bad word? And disability studies would say, no, it describes a difference. But if it is a bad word, then you want to dissociate yourself from it. I think that's part of what's going on here. The third point that Irwin engages is that the idea that the label disability encourages the victim mentality. Quote, because PWS have a legally defined disability, they may be entitled to concessions that encourage them to stay disfluent. In other words, there is a disincentive for people who stutter to seek therapy or respond positively to it. And Irwin's counterpoint: most commentators would agree that this is a possibility, but this position also assumes therapy could be effective for everyone who stutters, and clearly this is not the case. If we go back to the disability studies definition of disability, looking at a social and political category describing body minds that depart from the bodily, mental, and/or behavioral norms of a society, then stuttering is a disability. Mark Schell published a book in 2005 called Stutter. And in it, he describes something that he calls the language test. He's not advocating for this test. He's describing something that he has encountered in the world when it comes to language and humanity. So the first part of this test says, if you can't speak at all, then probably you are not a human being. Number 2, if you speak a little, then you might be a human being, but just as likely, you could be a parrot. And number 3, if you can't speak my particular language in my particular way, then you probably aren't a member of my tribe. So when in the same episode, the second episode, when we meet Simon's father, he says, the Hastings name cannot land in the quivering hands of a half-wit. Now, his nurse objects to this because he's very good at his letters, at his learning, as they would have said it then. But his father comes back and says, he would have to be bloody Shakespeare with his letters if he cannot speak. Think of the relationship or the similarity between the word unintelligible and the word unintelligent. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with in terms of disowning Simon because he stutters. Now, this is the third and last quote that I have from Simon's father from the second episode. And you'll notice a change in tone here. He says, my heart may be failing, but I assure you it swells with pride knowing the Duke you have grown into. This is Simon's father on his deathbed speaking to the grown adult Simon. And the father has changed his mind. So what is different? The Duke Simon has grown into no longer stutters. He speaks his father's language in his father's way, and so now can be considered part of his father's tribe. It is a disappearing stutter, though, and this is something called narrative prosthesis. Narrative prosthesis is an academic term or phrase developed by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder in a book of the same name published in 2000, which oddly enough is the same year that The Duke and I, the book that the Bridgerton is based on, this theory and that novel came out in the same year. Mitchell and Snyder state that our phrase narrative prosthesis is meant to indicate that disability has been used throughout history as a crutch upon which literary narratives lean for their representational power, disruptive potentiality, and analytical insight. So there are two things that happen in narrative prosthesis. Disability makes the story function, and disability is then contained and disappears. So Simon's childhood stutter serves as, quote, a springboard for the story that ensues, and then is, quote, left behind. Another example of this in popular culture is Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange's injured hands serve as a springboard for the story that ensues, and then are left behind. On the screen now is an image of Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange. It's early in the movie, and he's wearing hospital scrubs and a surgical cap and a mask and surgical gloves. He's getting ready for surgery, and he is a world-class neurosurgeon. He takes on cases other people won't. He's very full of himself because he's got all of these accolades because of how good he is at his job, which requires a great deal of fine motor muscle control. As the movie progresses, Doctor Strange gets into an accident in his car. This image shows Doctor Strange being thrown about the cabin of his car, and the airbag has deployed. There's glass everywhere. And then we see him in a hospital bed. He's got a couple of he's got a couple of butterfly bandages on his face, which is bruised. But what really takes up the image, or what catches the eye here, is the fact that his hands and arms are bandaged. There are pins in them, and they are suspended from the ceiling to allow them to heal properly. This is something that is what happened was Doctor Strange was in this car accident, and then he wasn't found within the golden hour of trauma. So by the time they found him, they couldn't repair his hands. They couldn't repair the nerves in his hands. He doesn't accept this as reality, though, and he does some digging around and finds out about a place called Kamar-Taj. So the image on the screen now is of Nepal. And Doctor Strange, who looks very scruffy, his hair is long, and in his face, his beard looks uncared for. He's not in snazzy clothing. He has traveled there to find Kamar-Taj to fix his hands. This image is from within the compound of Kamar-Taj. Dr. Strange has found it. They've accepted him as a student. He's with a bunch of other students. Everybody has their left hand in a martial arts pose near their body, and their right hand extended in the middle of a sparky red circle, if you will. This is something that the mystic arts allows you to create. Everybody has one except Dr. Strange. He can't do it. Eventually, he conquers the mystic arts and becomes the protector of the time stone, which he has around his neck in this image. This is the classic movie poster, Benedict Cumberbatch with the hair and the mustache and goatee, and the artifact, which is a cape that often saves his life, that kind of thing. He becomes this Doctor Strange, the comic book hero, as opposed to Doctor Strange, the neurosurgeon. So Stephen Strange's injured hands lead him to seek a cure to regain his career. He travels to Kamar-Taj, studies the mystic arts, and hijinks ensue. In the same way, Simon's stutter leads to him being disowned by his father, and he vows to never have children. And the dramatic tension between him and Daphne starts, and hijinks ensue. So what we have is the disability making the story function. If it weren't for the injury to Doctor Strange's hands, he would never go to Kamar-Taj. If it weren't for Simon's stutter, he would never have vowed to not have children, not get married, and there wouldn't be this tension with Daphne. So disability is then contained and disappears. Once Doctor Strange begins to study the mystic arts of Kamar-Taj, their mastery becomes his goal rather than returning to medicine. The injuries to his hands are not healed, but they are rendered irrelevant. So again, we have this image of him at Kamar-Taj. He's the only student who can't produce this sparky red circle. And the Ancient One, played by Tilda Swinton, is shown here in yellow and black, and she's kind of floating above the bottom of the image, and she looks very zen, if I may say so. She comes into the courtyard, and Doctor Strange apologetically says, "Oh, my hands," to explain why he doesn't have a sparky red circle. And the Ancient One says, "It's not about your hands." And Doctor Strange says, "How is this not about my hands?" So, in a bit of inspiration porn, the Ancient One introduces Master Hamir, who we can see in this image. If you can see the image, he is in kind of Buddhist-looking robes, if that's an okay thing to say. He's creating the sparky red circle. And if you can see in the upper right-hand corner, his left hand is not there. He has a right hand. He does not have a left hand. So this is what I mean by inspiration porn. He is demonstrating that it's possible to do this with one hand. So what's your problem? Get up and do the magic or the mystic arts. So, and then Doctor Strange does persist and actually make the sparky red circle. So Doctor Strange's hands recur as a theme in the rest of the movie, but Simon's stutter does not recur as a theme in Bridgerton. The adult Simon does not stutter. There are two exceptions, and this is the mention of the rape scene. The end of the second episode, he stutters, and after the rape. So the end of the second episode is contained. It's just this one episode in which he stutters, and at the very end, you're like, oh yeah, the adult Simon, I guess he stutters. But 7 other episodes, there's only one other time that he stutters, and that one is easily missed. It's easily missed in Bridgerton, which is, again, here is an image of the poster for Bridgerton with Daphne and Simon on the front, and an image of the book that it's based on, The Duke and I, by Julia Quinn. So while The Duke and I and Bridgerton are examples of narrative prosthesis in that they exploit and then marginalize disability in their narratives, the adaptation is more effective and successful at containing and rejecting disability. As a disability narrative, Bridgerton buries the lead. What I mean by this is, when do we learn of Simon's stutter? In The Duke and I, we learn about it in the prologue. So the first 20, 30 pages of the book is all about Simon stuttering as a child. In Bridgerton, we don't learn about this stutter until the second episode. So in the book, we learn about the stutter before we meet the adult Simon. Whereas in the show, we learn about it after we meet the adult Simon. Why does this matter? This is why it matters. This is a picture of Regé-Jean Page, who played Simon, and he's a very physically attractive, dark-skinned man, he's on the set of SNL. He gave a monologue and was hosting it in February of 2021, if I remember correctly. He's holding a brandy glass, I think it is. It's a glass of alcohol, and it looks like he's been spinning it and sniffing it. And he's got this eyebrow thing that he does that is just apparently sexy. So if you've seen this face and you've heard his voice as an adult first, then it's easy to be like, oh, he stuttered as a kid, whatever. One of the things that he says in the monologue is, it's hard for me to talk about myself because, well, it just makes me want to listen. So you have this sexy, sexy face with this sexy, sexy voice, and it really allows you to not pay a lot of attention to the backstory of his stutter. Also, Bridgerton does not explore Simon's inner thoughts about his speech. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides in the interest of time, just to say that just because Bridgerton doesn't explore the inner speech, doesn't mean that he cannot. So this is about adaptation theory. If there are any adaptation scholars in the audience that feel like they need to at me, you can let me know and we will sort it out. So in The Duke and I, early on in the book, Simon says to Anthony Bridgerton, who is Daphne's older brother, "Oh, for the love of Christ, Bridgerton, we were 20. All men are idiots at that age. Besides, you know damn well that..." Simon felt his tongue grow awkward and faked a coughing fit to cover his stammer. Damn, this happened so infrequently these days, but when it did, it was always when he was upset or angry. If he lost control over his emotions, he lost control over his speech. It was as simple as that. And unfortunately, episodes such as this only served to make him upset and angry with himself, which in turn exacerbated the stammer. It was the worst sort of vicious circle. Anthony looked at him quizzically. "Are you all right?" Simon nodded, and Simon nods a lot in the book because then he doesn't have to talk. He says, "Just a bit of dust in my throat," he lied. "Shall I ring for tea?" Simon nodded again. He didn't particularly want tea, but it seemed the sort of thing one would ask for if one truly did have dust in one's throat. So again, we can see what's going on emotionally for Simon in a way that if the stutter doesn't fade into the background the way it does in the show. So I have another example, but it's several slides of the rape scene, and it's also the same point that I've just made. So I'm going to flip through them. And here we have what is an unexpected disability narrative, one that is easily missed. So unlike Disability, Visibility, or Crip Camp, where disability is a driving force throughout, Doctor Strange and Bridgerton use disability to set up a story that is not about disability, and that is the crux of narrative prosthesis. More so than Doctor Strange, Bridgerton celebrates the disappearance of disability. In episode 8, Daphne says to Lady Danbury, "You helped him overcome his impediment." And Lady Danbury says, "I merely showed him what he was capable of all along. At the end of the day, the Duke's triumph was his and his alone." So I want to highlight the words overcome and triumph, because that is the relationship between, that is how Bridgerton poses disability. It is something to be overcome. I'm going to skip these slides because there's just more theory, but mostly to say that there is, in Disability, Visibility, the cover of which is on the screen, and in Crip Camp, the title slide there is on the screen. Disability is something that propels the story as opposed to something to be overcome. Another example of this, where disability is at the speaking center of the story, is a show called Speechless, which was on ABC for a couple of years. I believe it's still on Hulu. And this picture is Micah Fowler as JJ DeMeo. And both the actor and the character have cerebral palsy and use a wheelchair. And at the front of the chair looks like a tablet. It's kind of black in the middle with a gray border around it. That's actually an alphabet board. It has some common words, but all the letters of the alphabet. And if you look at JJ's face, it looks like there's a microphone on his right, our left, but it's actually a laser pointer, and he uses it to point to different letters on the alphabet board to communicate what he wants to say. And so this is another example of a disability narrative that celebrates disability rather than simply shoving it under the rug. Thank you very much. That is the presentation I have prepared for you today. And I believe we may have time for questions. Can't hear you, Allie.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi.
All right. Apologies, everybody, but thank you so much. That was a really wonderful talk. I really enjoyed that. To those of you who may be watching, we have a little bit of time left at the end here for questions. You can leave those as a comment, and I will be able to read them out loud, and we can try and talk through any questions you may have.
I'll say one thing while we wait for questions to come in briefly, is that I first wrote this presentation when only the first season of Bridgerton was out. The second season of Bridgerton has a very different relationship to disability. It's one that one of my disability studies mentors sees, and I don't always see it. But then you have Queen Charlotte. And that season prequel to the Bridgerton story has its own relationship to disability, and that's something that I'm happy to talk about.
Ooh. Oh, one moment. It looks like we do have a comment. Oh, this is a really good one. We have a comment asking, can you speak to any influence of gender on the characters' narratives?
That's very interesting, because the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of gender is the scene where Daphne forces Simon to be sexually active with her when he doesn't want to. But I think that gender also influences Simon's father's relationship to him. If Simon had been a girl, and if Simon had had a brother, then it would have been that brother that the Hastings name would have fallen to. If Simon had been a girl, there wouldn't have been as much at stake in his ability to speak as far as his father was concerned, I think. In terms of Daphne, you know, the whole, like, she wants suitors, she doesn't have any suitors. If she is seen promenading with Simon, then she'll get suitors. It's this whole thing of a woman being an object to be seen and desired. So that's what I would say about that.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. We have about 5 minutes left. Were there any other comments or questions that anybody out there had? Ooh. Oh, fabulous. Okay. So one person says, really interesting. They were able to join a bit late, but they were hoping to find a place where they could read more about the Doctor Strange portion of the presentation.
If you Google Doctor Strange and disability, you'll come across an article about Orientalism and disability in Doctor Strange. So Orientalism is a way of talking about how the West, if you will, views what we like to call the East, or the Orient. And the idea that Doctor Strange starts in New York City, I believe. He expends every effort to get Western medicine to fix his hands, and only then will he pursue Eastern medicine, if you will, non-traditional, non-Western medical intervention to get his hands back to where he wants them. And so it's like the Orient is there to be used and not to be valued as an equal partner in anything. And that article has several paragraphs on the relationship between Doctor Strange and disability and Orientalism. So that's one place that I would recommend. Also, I am available to chat with people, one-on-one or exchange emails. So I think if you get in touch with the DC Public Library, they can put you in touch with me, and I'm happy to have that conversation.
Yes, definitely. And the folks to reach out to get in touch is the Center for Accessibility here at the MLK Library. They are the ones to thank for bringing this wonderful talk to us virtually. You can email them at dcpl.access, ACCESS, at dc.gov. Or you can visit us in person. They are on the second floor of the MLK Library. So that is also very fascinating. And speaking personally as somebody who's Indigenous, that the narrative and sort of critique of Orientalism in the Marvel movies is close to me. It is close to my heart.
Yes.
So that said, we have another really fascinating question, and this one will probably round us out for the evening.
Okay.
We have another one asking if we can situate Doctor Strange's disability in the larger MCU context.
Ooh.
Right? That's a good one.
That is a good one. And I think that, like, every superhero, has an origin story. But Doctor Strange is the only one that I can think of whose origin story starts in disability in terms of the MCU. So you have Iron Man, who augments his ability in order to escape a cave, and you have, Thor doesn't really have an origin story. He's from Asgard. He doesn't really need one. Spider-Man gets bitten by a radioactive spider and then develops powers. The Black Widow is kidnapped and put into turned into a fighting machine and then escapes that life. So, like, it's interesting to look at, like, what is the origin story for each of these superheroes, and what is the relationship between their body before the origin story starts and their body after the origin story starts. So, like, Superman and whether he shoots the webs out of his hands or does it with little vials of web stuff, like, being able to have that spidey sense, again, body mind not separated. That's a shift in his relationship to his body mind. But it didn't start with, I was a world-renowned doctor and now I can't be because my hands are injured. Let me go and try to fix them. Ooh, mystic arts. And then I'm going to master them rather than try to become a surgeon again. Like, that's the arc that I see for Doctor Strange, and how that kind of disability is the reason Doctor Strange becomes Doctor Strange that we know in the comic book world, as opposed to just in the neurosurgery world. So I think that the other thing I'll say really quickly is that if you haven't seen Hawkeye, you should, because Hawkeye is the Jeremy Renner plays a hearing impaired superhero, and they do really interesting things with that in that series. But other than that, I can't think of. I know that there are more disabled superheroes in the Marvel universe, but not necessarily the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Right. That makes sense to me. Oh, that's actually another good question that we have from somebody here in the room. I wonder if Moon Knight would count.
Yes, that's exactly who I was thinking of in terms of disabled Marvel, not necessarily MCU. I couldn't think of the name. I've not watched that series, but I believe that that would be like if you were to pull together a panel on disability in the MCU, you would need a presenter on Moon Knight.
Maybe we'll have to do that at some point in the future. All right. Well, unfortunately, that does bring us to 8 p.m., which means it is the end of our talk for tonight. Once again, Tolanda, thank you so much for giving this talk again, especially with the pivot to virtual.
Mhm.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Yeah, and I hope that all of you have a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful rest of your weekend. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's still live.